So Donald Trump came into office, or was elected on the popular pledge to deport lots of people, just to deport any undocumented immigrant possible in the US. This was a result of the unpopular TPS, or temporary protective status program, which kind of ran amok, and as well as hysterical media coverage, which focused incessantly on crimes committed by migrants. There was I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, a guy sawed the head off of his 1-year-old son in California. Hardly anyone paid attention to that. If that had been a migrant, it would have been huge. But nevertheless, it's a popular program. Mass deportation is popular. It helped fuel Trump's election or re-election. And now they're going ahead with it. And the White House is tweeting out photos of deportations, promises made, promises kept, deportation flights. And this is like a flight on a massive military transport plane. Anyone who paid attention during the Biden era knew these flights were taking place on less flashy planes. But no one was paying attention to that. I mean, the perception was that Biden wasn't actually deporting masses of people when that's been taking place. Obama became the deportation king first. Deportations by ICE reached a 10-year peak in 2024, surpassing the Trump era. The Trump people are claiming that's because they had secured the border. There may be some truth to it because Biden let in so many other people. But anyway, they're starting with deportation flights, many to South America, of migrants who've been convicted of crimes, including petty crimes, but also violent crimes. And Gustavo Petro, who is the first leftist president, he's a social democrat who's been elected since the treaty between the Colombian government and FARC, and was a member of the student movement that supported the uprising in Colombia, was kind of a Marxist intellectual activist, and is now president, has decided to start a war of words with Trump over the deportations to Colombia. And I'll read some of his statement. But first, let me say, I like Gustavo Petro. He congratulated me personally on confronting Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, for his singular role in presiding over the Gaza genocide. Petro had stopped coal exports to Israel and tried to actually be part of an economic blockade to force a ceasefire. It was a courageous thing to do. He's a breath of fresh air in a country where the alternative is, retrograde, U.S.-controlled neoliberals. The leader of them really is Alvaro Uribe, who was also kind of a behind-the-scenes narco trafficker who forged close friendships with Marco Rubio, the Bush administration, and the kind of global neoliberal forces. So Petro introduces this statement threatening 50% tariffs on U.S. goods as Trump threatens to levy tariffs against Colombia, because he wanted it to establish a protocol for receiving deportees. He didn't want them on military jets, handcuffed, and he didn't want to let Trump make a whole show of it. But then he launches this long note saying, I don't like traveling to the U.S. It's boring. I like going to the Black neighborhoods in Washington. There I saw a struggle in the U.S. Capitol between Black people and Latinos with barricades, which seems silly to me because they should unite. I lived in Washington. I don't know what struggle he's talking about there, where the Blacks and Latinos were fighting over barricades. He confesses that he likes Walt Whitman, Paul Simon, Chomsky, and Miller. I guess he's referring to Arthur Miller and not Stephen Miller, who's Trump's deportation czar de facto. Paul Simon Haven't heard from that guy in a while. Paul Simon actually played in South Africa during apartheid and broke the embargo. He likes Sacco and Vanzetti. They were killed for being labor leaders. He doesn't like your oil, Trump. But he will have a glass of whiskey with Trump, which he will accept despite his gastritis, which we can talk openly about this, but it's difficult because you consider me an inferior race. Trump doesn't drink, by the way. So this is how he's approaching Trump. And then he basically says, I will die by my law. I resisted torture and I resist you, because he was tortured by the Colombian military junta. I don't want slave owners beside Colombia. If you can't accompany me, I will go elsewhere. Colombia is the heart of the world. And he's just getting poetic. You will kill me, but I will survive in my town, which is before yours in the Americas. We are the peoples of the winds, mountains, the Caribbean Sea, and freedom. He goes on and on and on. Kill me, President, and the Americas and humanity will respond. He's ready to die. You will never dominate us. The warrior who once rode our land, shouting freedom, is Bolivar. It just goes on. And then at the end, he's like, you want to put a 50% tariff on us? Let our people sow maize, or corn, which was discovered in Colombia, and feed the world. And,
reminiscent of Hugo Chavez, the way he's speaking.
I think Chavez was a much better writer and poet than that. But yeah,
but just in terms
I don't
of
know
like
if Chavez would have liked Paul Simon's Graceland, but
just in terms of the defiance and not being afraid to die, and it sounds like he's basically worried about Trump trying to regime change him, which is a fair concern given the history of the U.S. in Latin America. And this starts over basically him refusing to accept some U.S. military flights and feeling that people are not treated fairly. But it sounds like from what's happened since, he's backed down in the face of Trump's threats.
So he was ready to die like Biggie, and then he backed down. Colombia yields on U.S. deportation flights to avert trade war, which obviously would have been very destructive to the Colombian peso. And yeah, our coffee prices would have gone up, which would have probably benefited coffee makers in Nicaragua and elsewhere. But it would have been much more damaging to Colombia, and it would have empowered Petro's rivals. A looming trade war between this is the BBC, keep in mind. A looming trade war between the U.S. and Colombia appears to have been averted after the Colombian government agreed to allow U.S. military flights carrying deported migrants. But it appears that the concession that Petro got is they won't be sent on giant military planes and in handcuffs and kind of paraded around as I believe these were Ecuadorian immigrants here. But this is, it's about something much bigger, which I think is why it's important to cover. And the peril that Latin American leaders face. Gustavo Petro subsequently tweeted a performance by Los Tigres del Norte, the corrido band from Mexico, and Zach De La Rocha from Rage Against the Machine. And it's basically like, we are American, the border, we didn't cross the border crossed us. It's very nationalistic. And the leftist Latin American leaders are countering Trump with nationalistic rhetoric and banking on it becoming popular across the continent in retaliation against what Trump is doing. And a big war is brewing. And at the center of the war, it's a political war, is Marco Rubio, who is obsessed with, he would love to regime change Colombia and has threatened Petro before as a senator. They're desperate to counter China in Latin America. And Petro has said, we will open up to the world if you continue to do this. But so far, he hasn't done that. And I can't predict which way this will go. There is a meeting of CELAC, of many Latin American presidents in Tegucigalpa in Honduras, couldn't make it, hosted by Xiomara Castro, who is the social democratic leftist president of her country. And she has said in retaliation to Trump's plans to deport masses of Hondurans on military flights that she will place in the crosshairs the largest U.S. military base in Latin America, which is right there, smack in the middle of Honduras, the Palmerola base. That is significant. That is something that Petro did not threaten. That's something that Chavez certainly would have threatened if there were Venezuelan bases. Colombian military cooperation with the U.S. has been so central. The Colombian military was built by the U.S., and the U.S. also supported the right-wing militias in Colombia. So it's hard for Petro to make that move. But the Palmerola base, I mean, this is major. I actually visited it. I didn't get to go inside, but I drove by it back in like 2018. And this was at the time when the U.S. was propping up a narco cartel as the government of Colombia. Juan Orlando Hernandez, who has now been convicted and sentenced to life in a U.S. federal prison, along with his brother, Tony Hernandez. And the Palmerola base was just sitting there supposedly doing counter-narcotics, counter-trafficking operations while this guy was shipping record amounts of narcotics to the U.S. It was originally put there in the 80s under the watch of John Negroponte, remember him, to counter the rise of socialism across Central America. So, I mean,
the guy who pretended to be an ambassador to Honduras while running a covert war against neighboring Nicaragua.
Yep.
Yeah.
So here, I'll like drop the link in the chat. But I just basically walked around the base and just talked.
A foreign power had a base like this in your country, and was
here's an interesting part.
You know, it's a tribute to the greatness. It actually has a Honduran flag on it, and this is, you know, from the Honduran Air Force. This is the planes I guess they get. I don't know. They don't get the best technology. They certainly don't get what the Israelis get. Speaking of the Israelis, Honduran media is reporting that 1,000 Israeli soldiers are either on the way to Palmerola Air Base or are here. Israel is one of the top 3 military partners of Honduras. It's part of the relationship that Honduras has with the United States. The other one, of course, is the Israel of South America, Colombia. Now, what are Israeli soldiers going to do in Honduras? Why are they here? Well, they're supposedly here to train the Honduran military in counter-migration tactics. In other words, in keeping Hondurans in the panopticon that the United States has built for them. And so they're deploying from here to the Salvadoran border, which is just down this road here. And we have actually heard reports from the human rights group COPIN, which we're going to visit later today, that Israeli troops have already deployed by the border. So the tactics that apartheid Israel uses in repressing Palestinians and keeping Palestinians in ghettos and cantons and essentially open-air prisons are now being applied here in Honduras through this massive air base, military base, basically city for Americans. We saw some of those Americans when we arrived at the airport. The only other gringos had, you know, army rucksacks and very clear military indications.
So I think the Palmerola Air Base is at the center of this clash. What Xiomara Castro is saying is, you know, if you don't want Hondurans in your country, why should we accept Americans in our country as a kind of hostile force, which have traditionally propped up governments, de facto dictatorships like that of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who came into power on a 2009 coup. And Marco Rubio is not going to respond elegantly to this. I think that this is going to be the center of his agenda as Secretary of State. If you look at who Donald Trump has appointed as the head of Latin American affairs in his National Security Council, it's Cuban American hardliner who led what's his name? Caron, Mauricio Clever Caron, and he would lead this Wednesday group in Washington where all of the Cuban American Gusano right wingers who want to destroy the revolutionary government in Cuba would get together and just plot. And he helped oversee the Venezuela coup of 2018, 2019. They're going full steam ahead. The deportation policy is becoming tied into the regime change policy, and Petro is trying to kind of set the tone, but he's not backing it up with any real action. So
it's a point, it's a point I've made, a million times, and you can read so much documentation to back this up in Anya Parampil's book, Corporate Coup. It's like Trump goes and demonizes migrants, and there is an issue with undocumented immigration here. No one denies that, but missing from the conversation is the acknowledgement that the U.S. creates the very conditions that force people to flee. And the point about why should, you can't claim to not want our migrants while still causing people to flee with sanctions and regime change operations, and also claiming to maintain hostile military bases in our country. I think it's a great point. It's a defense of Latin American sovereignty, but that point is missing from the entire conversation. Like the debate between Democrats and Republicans presupposes the right of the U.S., the self-declared right of the U.S. to meddle in Latin America. A few progressive lawmakers have started talking about it only recently, like what's his name, Greg Cesar, I think, of Texas, and AOC has also mentioned this. But if only we could have an actual debate about it, because if not for all these sanctions and regime change operations going back decades, you wouldn't see so many people, and also so-called free trade agreements that have destroyed entire industries in Latin America
and in the U.S.
and in the U.S. too. You wouldn't see
like the
so
flower
much
industry in California was destroyed by that, and we get our flowers from Colombia. That was under Bush. So yeah, I mean, that's MAGA wants to have it both ways. They want to, they think that, or no, they think they can end it all with just putting a bunch of military assets on the border and continue to have the military in Honduras and have the military across the Latin American subcontinent and put a new base in Argentina under Javier Milei and continue to, there isn't much discourse about the damage of the free trade deals as there was under the first Trump administration in 2016, 2017. So there needs to be a recognition. And the sanctions, obviously, sanctions are the most damaging aspect of this, especially on Venezuela. Petro pointed this out. The whole reason that you have all these Venezuelans in your country is because of the sanctions on Venezuela that you supported.
As the Trump administration was warned about, the Washington Post reported this last year, that there was explicit warnings. If you impose these sanctions as part of your regime change operation, there's going to be a wave of migration. And Trump, despite claiming to care about migration, ignored that. I mean, I'm not even sure if he was directly warned. It was certainly his top officials like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo who knew exactly this. So Trump caused the very migration that he now claims to be cracking down on. And until there's a serious reckoning with that, there just won't be a change. We'll just be in this spiral. And the whole thing's very cynical. And if you read the U.S. media, they do their part in this. Whenever they're covering a country like Venezuela, the sanctions get like a passing mention. Finally, the Washington Post came out with that article late last year about the sanctions on Venezuela and how they cause migration. But that was obvious from the start. You could read that or hear that at the Grayzone from the very start. And if you read the articles, the sanctions always get a passing mention, deep down about how it's a factor in a country's problems, but it doesn't ever get the attention that it deserves.
Yeah. Here's Francisco Rodriguez, who's an opposition figure in Venezuela in the Hill just 3 days ago. This should be, in every op-ed page, but Trump's liberal opposition doesn't want to discuss it because they would love to put right-wing neoliberal governments in power, just as Elon Musk and Marco Rubio would in Venezuela and elsewhere.
Yeah, and look at their asylum policies reflect this. Whenever the U.S. is trying to overthrow a certain government, that means that people fleeing that government, they're given temporary protected status, like Haiti,
Yeah.
Venezuela, Nicaragua. But as soon as we install a government that we like as was the case in Haiti, that stops. So
Yeah.
Aristide, for example, when the Bush administration and the Clinton, when the Bush administration overthrew Aristide the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, and then a dictatorship came in, all of a sudden, then Haitian refugees were cut off and sent to places like Guantanamo. When the George W. Bush administration resumed trying to overthrow Aristide after Aristide was elected again, that's when again you had more asylum cases open up to Haiti's fleeing, and then as soon as he's overthrown again, that stops. And same with Venezuela. Like Biden gave, and Trump too, actually, I think certainly Biden gave temporary protected status to Venezuelans fleeing, because again he's trying to overthrow the government. So there's an interest there in showing, look, all these people are fleeing this horrible tyrannical government. And that's why we have to keep trying to overthrow them and imposing crippling sanctions. As soon as that succeeds, though, the asylum stops.
Yeah. And the asylum was also Marco Rubio's initiative and the initiative of the Venezuelan opposition to create a domestic regime change lobby, just as the Cuban anti-government forces did the same in South Florida. So they created TPS for that. And then the Democrats added Haiti just to offset the Venezuelan, Nicaraguan, and Cuban population. And then they had a deal. The Democrats were just like, Haitians vote for us, so just add that, and then we'll just give everyone parole. It didn't work out very well, and Trump milked it for all it was worth. And Fox News milked every migrant crime story into the Laken-Riley Act, which basically removes due process, is unconstitutional. Any accusation becomes a conviction, and bam, here we are. But the real issue of sanctions and U.S. foreign policy isn't being addressed